Open up, Sonny. Try that door.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Solomon Goldstein-Rose, who is an American politician, climate activist, and an author, and who has served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. So, it's quite interesting because you talk about that as early as at the age of 11, you started to become very much aware of climate change, and you decided to become active in terms of speaking out around your concern around climate change. Can you tell me what was kind of that trigger point at such a young age to figure out that this was something that was important to you?
The impressive thing is that I don't remember when I first learned about climate change. It's something that I think for me and a lot of people my age, we have taken for granted. Our parents taught us, or we were taught in school. I know both happened for me at some point, but I've taken for granted that it's the most important issue we have to address. When I was 11, I started being a youth activist and thinking, oh, hey, young people can do things just as well as adults. And I had a great teacher in 6th grade who read us a book of stories of other young people that had done projects in their community or around the world, even elementary school aged kids who had done things, activist projects. And that was one of the things that immediately inspired some of my early activism.
Now, for you at that early of an age, what did that activism look like, and how did it get actually manifested, and what was the impact that you had?
The very first thing that I did was organize a petition to send to various members of Congress against oil drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And that was a purely local thing. I got signatures at the side of soccer games in my town and that kind of thing. The projects that I got into from then were more in our school district. I started a container recycling program at my elementary school and worked on a campaign with a parent and teacher and others to get the school buses to stop idling their engines when they're outside of school, which is awful for kids' health as well as for climate change. And from there got into the sort of school district-based advocacy. And that was a good way to learn and eventually get more and more involved in that sort of the institutional processes that then I later applied to larger institutions.
So just as a side note, I've always wondered that myself in terms of why buses idle. So what was their reasoning as to why the buses have to idle?
Well, we did this for a year and we got them to pretty much stop idling. So there wasn't that much reasoning. It was just something people hadn't pointed out in large part. The concern that bus drivers, if you don't talk it through with them, have is that the battery might die because you have to be flashing the red lights or running a heater or whatever. And if you're stopping for just a moment, letting people out, on the route, you're going to keep the engine running. But if you're stopping outside school, we looked into the science and there were studies and they were like, okay, it's not going to drain the battery to have the lights flashing for half an hour or whatever it would be.
So we're going to come back to this notion around, let's call it, low-hanging fruits, but also this kind of myths and misconceptions, right? And behavioral change. So we'll come back to that. So eventually, from kind of local movement to at the state level, you served at in the Massachusetts House of Representatives in your early 20s, and you worked on a number of different things, including energy policies. Are you able to kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah. So climate change remained my top priority. I ran for state legislature when my longtime state rep was retired and got elected on a platform focused largely on promoting clean energy development and innovative clean energy technologies that Massachusetts could be a leader on. And so one of the things that I little things I got done was in promoting battery procurement targets for utilities to integrate batteries onto the grid. It was small things. I did leave after one term deciding that I could have a bigger impact by focusing more nationally and globally. So I wouldn't pretend that it was major impact at the state level. But I also worked on inspiring a battery testing center and some projects at the University of Massachusetts to innovate new battery technologies and demonstrate what could work for grid storage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot to cover when it comes to energy. Everything from, let's say, the renewable mix. Whether it's hydrogen, solar, PV, wind, to even to water aspects, and of course storage aspects as well. So when you think about kind of the big picture perspective, and if you had the ability to actually control things at the national level, what are some kind of big sweeping aspects of energy that you love to see change or happen so that we can actually start to decarbonize?
So when I decided not to run for re-election, I did a bunch of research and analysis and outreach that turned into a book. And that was basically me trying to wrap my head around what needs to happen globally, what are the physical steps that we need to accomplish. And so I divided it into 5 pillars of the sort of sweeping transformations that we need. The first is electricity generation. We need to, as you said, have all the various types of clean generation scale up, not just to replace current fossil fuel plants, but to scale larger, because we're going to need more electricity than we have now to electrify other things. That's the second pillar: electrify transportation, home heating, that kind of thing. And then the third pillar is synthesizing carbon neutral fuels, because we can't electrify everything on the time frame we have. For instance, long distance airplanes are not going to be electric by 2050. And then the fourth pillar is non-energy shifts. There are various processes, agriculture, industrial processes, that need different practices or different technologies, but it's not about burning fossil fuels. And then fifth is sequestration. And so we need to incentivize actually pulling carbon out of the atmosphere to get to net zero and into net negative emissions, so that we draw down the amount of greenhouse gases and actually get back to a stable climate over time. That's crucial. And that's something that actually the new administration is looking into, is supporting research into. Is direct air capture and things like that. So policies to incentivize, subsidize any of these technologies. One of the key things that the national government should be doing is funding demonstration projects for new technologies or new systems, things that where it might be developed in a lab. It's not funding basic research, but you need to build the first commercial size system, because this is hard technology, and to attract investment to scale up, it needs to be proven at full scale, commercial size power plants or whatever it is. And that's a key piece that not enough people are funding right now.
Yeah, actually, that's a great point. And I want to just kind of expand on that point, and as well as kind of relate it, is when you think about the 5 pillars that you've laid out. And I think, we're really starting to get to a point in 2021 where this topic around climate change mitigation adaptation has become, I think, kind of central to lots of narratives and conversations. But what do you feel like out of the 5 pillars are people not talking about enough?
That's a great question.
And why is that important?
People think a lot about electricity, the generation of electricity, and things that we can electrify, like cars. People think less about other uses of fossil fuels, like in industrial processes, which are much harder to electrify. Cement making, steel making, these are huge slices of emissions. And not all of these are going to be electrified. So that synthesized fuels piece of using, when we have excess clean electricity on the grid, using it to produce hydrogen or ammonia, which is a good carrier for hydrogen, or actually sucking CO2 out of the air and combining it with hydrogen to make gasoline or diesel or jet fuel or even methane. That's something people don't talk as much about, but that's going to be a key piece. And the sooner that happens and becomes cost competitive, the faster we can decarbonize, because those can drop into existing infrastructure. The other piece, I think, is the non-energy part, agricultural processes, and methane, which is so much more powerful if you look over a shorter time frame. Normally methane is compared over 100-year time frame, but we only have a few decades to see what the peak warming we get to is. 100 years from now, we'll be doing sequestration. I believe that we'll be there. But 20, 30 years from now, what's the peak temperature we're going to reach in warming? That's what's going to determine how many species go extinct and what the maximum impacts on humans are. And so looking over that shorter time frame, methane is actually about a third of our total emissions. And some of that is simply leaking from fossil fuel extraction. Some of that comes from cow belches, actually a sizable piece that we need to address. And several other sources, landfills. So these non-energy pieces need much more attention. And some of them have technological solutions. Some of them really need policy, or even like deforestation really needs global international pressure, trade pressure on countries that should be doing a better job protecting their rainforests.
Yeah, I really like some of the things that you brought up, around methane as an example. And again, we come across a lot of different startups that's working on climate change mitigation adaptation, including those that are focusing more from a satellite perspective, whether they're using IR thermal or hyperspectra to actually identify these types of gas leaks. And again, in a gas production, let's say, whether it's the pipes, whether it's the the generation of the energy, there's going to be leaks, right? So identifying it and being able to stop it, and again, positioning it from the perspective of cost reduction and cost savings, as well as potential compliance issues.
Yeah, I actually had my first couple conversations with people working on possibly filtering methane out of the atmosphere, converting it to CO2, or even removing it, which is definitely something that more people should probably look into.
And then you also mentioned cow belches, or really, it's the byproduct of the cattle industry, really. And I wonder, how do we move that along? Because with any special interest group, you're effectively dealing with a lobbying entity, an industry that is looking to protect their economic interests. So they're already pushing back on, lab cell-based meat and aqua products, for instance. So how do we address a group that is not looking to lose their revenue anytime soon?
Yeah, I think that meat alternatives are a piece of that. It's the one case where I would say that dietary changes can play a role. And the more we can systemically get people to eat less beef, especially, not even meat in general, but beef particularly, that can help. I don't think that that's going to be a complete solution, because I don't think that anything can be solved on a 30-year time frame by trying to get people to live totally differently. You're not going to convince everyone in the world to become vegetarian. So there are some technological solutions. There's actually a kind of seaweed that you can mix in a very small percent to cattle feed, and it dramatically reduces methane emissions, like maybe 80%. So there are several startups working on growing that seaweed at scale, and there are farmers interested in demonstrating. There are companies that buy beef that are interested in having sort of, the being able to tell their customers that they're green, they're sustainable. And so they're pressuring the cattle farmers to actually use this additive. So there are pieces like that. I'm not sure that's a slice of emissions that we're going to 100% eliminate, which is part of why we need sequestration as well to balance out. But we can get a lot of the way there.
Yeah. So on this show, we get a lot of interesting people, and some of their perspectives is that really, why are we spending so much time on talking about solutions, whether it's technical solutions or policy solutions? Why don't we focus on the consumerism? It's as long as we live a certain way in terms of lifestyle, whether it's our clothes, that has certain polyester, certain kind of, oil-based, petroleum-based type of derivative products, or to the kinds of things that we eat. How do we balance our behavioral change, lifestyle change, with balance a solution? And what do you think is kind of that realistic approach that balances those 5 pillars that you're talking about?
Yeah, the key thing when thinking about lifestyle change and societal change is the timeline. there are two different timelines. One is the timeline for solving climate change, which is very defined, short term. The other is the timeline for getting to our ideal society. A lot of people conflate those, and they think when we solve climate change, we should go immediately to what they think is the ideal grid, and microgrids with wind and solar and local batteries. And I think that is what a lot of grids will look like 100 years from now. But right now, we actually don't have the means to make that the system that everyone in the world uses. There are a lot of things that eventually will come lower in price, but are too expensive right now to roll out globally. Wind and solar simply take up so much land space. You might not be able to add enough of them if they're the only thing that you're trying to use to get where we need for electricity generation in 30 years. So there's these two different timeframes. Anything that's relying on changing people's behavior, changing people's lifestyle, is a longer time frame. That's trying to grapple with human nature. And I think there are other environmental problems that, people sometimes talk about climate change as environmental, and it is, and that it affects other species. It's also the biggest human problem. But there are environmental problems totally separate from climate change, like what we're doing with plastic in the ocean and other waste issues. We need to solve those. That's a longer time frame. And some of that will require lifestyle change. Some of that I hope involves lifestyle change, because there's so many ways in which we could be treating each other better and living in more balanced ways across countries with the natural world. But it's actually all too common for there to be rhetoric saying, to solve climate change, we need lifestyle change and sacrifice. We need to consume less, essentially. And that's not true, because 2/3 of emissions come from developing countries where lifestyles are relatively modest, and the lowest cost equipment is always going to win. So to solve climate change, we need to scale up in the richer countries. We need to invent some things, scale up what's emerging already, so that it becomes cheap enough that it can spread worldwide. That's the key challenge, and it requires collective action. No one individual can do everything that we need. We need the federal government, we need large companies, we need other governments to scale up all of the technologies that we need. And so as individuals, we need to think less in terms of our personal behavior change or our personal carbon footprint or whatnot, and more our responsibility is to drive that collective action.
Yeah, I really appreciate your point. I think you're probably one of the 100 out of 100 guests that I've had that had this point of view. And I think this is a very much a moderate and a necessary perspective that we don't hear often enough, because essentially it's a timescale issue. I think it's great that the entire society at some point embraces a certain type of lifestyle, but that could easily take hundreds of years before we actually get there.
And it's a sort of Western country-centric issue as well. That people who are climate activists tend to be wealthier. I'm from a relatively privileged background on the global scale, and certainly, if I weren't, I probably wouldn't have had the ability to go deep into climate activism. But we often forget that 2/3 of emissions come from developing countries. It can't be about lifestyle change. If we're going to solve it, we have to have really cheap equipment that outcompetes fossil fuels globally.
So I want to go back to one of the things that you brought up earlier, which is this notion of the role of government in actually creating essentially a proof of concept that is at a certain scale that's demonstratable, so that it really starts to catch on. So let's talk about some things that kind of potentially could fit into that. Storage is definitely one of those things, but let's talk about things like, let's say, nuclear fusion. So there are a number of very well funded, including those, the likes of energy venture partners, backed by Bill Gates and others, that have funded invested into these types of nuclear fusion, more commercializable. One in particular, I think, is working on a type of a magnet to be able to control some of the heat aspects. So that's a type of I think, really kind of long-term, deep tech types of solution that can have a huge impact. But yet, how do we get government to really, take a stance? And again, given the fact that, at least in the US anyways, we have this bipartisan impasse, right? So no matter what the Biden administration chooses to do or desires to do, the reality of actually getting that passed through legislation is going to be nearly, I think in my opinion, almost impossible to an extent. But yet the role of government is so critical. And we see this, overlapping with kind of the DoD aspects in terms of some of the technologies that goes through DARPA and the Air Force, whether it's through CIBR or SCTR, that allows for some of these things to come out of the university into more of a proof of concept, into some form of scale. But how do we actually do this? Because again, I'm in the role of the private capital markets, right? So, who should bear the risk, and how do we actually get this to not just the developed nations, but to your point, the underdeveloped nation, which means that we have to have massive scale and drive down that marginal cost down to almost negligible.
Yeah. The one interesting thing is that innovation is one of the most bipartisanly supported policies. Almost no one is against demonstration for emerging technologies or support for R&D. In fact, at one point, Trump tried to cut the budget for ARPA-E, the core clean energy research demonstration agency, and it was Republicans in the Senate that stepped in and saved it, in fact, increased its budget. And so that kind of thing, I think, will happen. There was some funding for that passed in December. The Biden administration has said they're going to create a new ARPA-C for climate change specific carbon removal and other such things. So I think that that's happening, and we need the scale, and that's where Congress comes in. I think probably the vehicle will be the economic recovery bill, maybe not the immediate stimulus while we're still in the pandemic, but once we have the ability to think a little into the future and think about recovery and putting the economy back, putting the pieces back together, getting people back to work, one good way to do that is to make some big investments in the demonstration and early scale up of clean infrastructure. Because there's a lot that needs to be built. There's a lot that needs to be manufactured. The Biden administration has said they really want to reinvigorate American manufacturing. And that in particular for electric vehicles, for hydrogen electrolyzers. There are a lot of things that we could be putting people to work in the near term in jobs that will last throughout this century. And so I think that that's a good role. I think that it probably also won't be the US federal government stepping in to do as much as we wish they would. And so there's going to be a role for companies and private investors to choose certain things. And for other governments, Europe is making some big bets with hydrogen, and that's great. They're going to scale up a market for clean hydrogen, which is an essential piece of any transition globally. And so individual countries can find their niche and choose something, be that steelmaking or cement, hydrogen, agriculture, and find pieces that no one else is fully addressing and go big into demonstrating those.
So again, for me, I keep coming back to 2021 because I find it such an interesting year. If you look back in history, let's say 100 years from now, we have things such as the electrification of not just, passenger vehicles, but really the industrial side as well. And to your point, big movement around hydrogen, which I think in many ways will actually, support things like rail and trucks and, cargo airplanes, things that, can't currently go with the current battery energy density, for instance, as well as just the general sentiment around climate change. And then, of course, even the oil companies are recognizing that the assets that they're holding is becoming more of a liability, and that they're starting to recognize the need to diversify, whether it's to hydrogen or to clean energy into their portfolio. So it's a very interesting year. If you were to kind of look out the next 2 to 5 years, where do you think are going to be the big opportunities, whether it's from an investor perspective or big opportunities from a federal or state perspective?
It's a great question, and one that I've been asking myself is, in the near term, where could I or any given person, organization, or investor make the most difference and try to identify those gaps? So I don't have the answers on that. I think that in the US, we're seeing a big focus on electric vehicles, and that's really great because that's ready for acceleration. We just need to scale up manufacturing of EVs, and their capital costs will come down close enough to gas cars that their operating advantage makes them just cheaper overall. So that's exciting. I think that we're going to see, as I said, hydrogen in Europe. Europe has signaled more interest in centering clean infrastructure in their entire COVID recovery. And so that's great. I don't know what technologies in particular they'll focus on, but for companies looking to find an early market for clean hydrogen or other fuel things or electrification technologies, I think that that's going to help a lot. I think that there are some pieces that have been going better, like deforestation. Indonesia is one of the biggest countries in terms of deforestation. And I read an article today about how they've really gotten a lot of the deforestation and loss of peatland under control. Not good enough, but it's gone way in the right direction just in the last few years. And so that's something that I think governments and nonprofits are working on and can accelerate and probably will turn more attention to in the next few years as well.
Super. So with that, I have been joined by Solomon Goldstein-Rose, who is a climate activist, an American politician, and an author. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.